The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the concert hall, dust particles dancing in the golden beams. Alessandro Rossi rubbed his tired eyes and checked his watch. He'd arrived 2 hours early for the master class he was scheduled to teach at the renowned Westfield Academy of Music. His flight had landed earlier than expected, and rather than wait at his hotel, he'd decided to familiarize himself with the venue. The famous pianist moved quietly through the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. 20 years of performing on the world's grandest stages, and still, each new hall gave him a flutter of anticipation. At 45, Alessandro was at the peak of his career. His latest tour had sold out in every city, and critics hailed him as the defining classical pianist of his generation. But today, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. The constant travel, the endless performances, the polite small talk at receptions, it was wearing him down. Alessandro hadn't admitted it to anyone, not even himself, but the passion that once drove him to practice 12 hours a day had dimmed to a flicker. As he approached the main auditorium, Alessandro heard something that made him pause. Piano notes, delicate but confident, floated through the air. Mozart's Sonata No. 16 in C major, not an unusual choice for a music school, but something about the playing caught his attention. The tempo was slightly unorthodox, the emphasis on certain notes unconventional, but somehow right. Alessandro quietly pushed open the heavy wooden door and slipped inside. The auditorium was dark except for a single spotlight illuminating the grand piano on stage. Seated at the bench was a small figure, a boy who couldn't have been older than 12. The child's hands moved across the keys with fluid grace, his head swaying gently with the music. Alessandro stood frozen in the back of the hall listening. The boy wasn't just playing the notes. He was telling a story through them. It was Mozart as Alessandro had never heard it before, playful in parts where most pianists turned serious, wistful in sections typically played with technical precision. As Alessandro moved closer to the stage, he noticed something unusual. The boy wasn't looking at sheet music. In fact, he wasn't looking at the keys either. His gaze was fixed somewhere above the piano, unfocused. When Alessandro reached the front row, he accidentally bumped against a chair, creating a soft thud that echoed in the quiet hall. The music stopped abruptly. "Who's there?" the boy called out, his hands hovering uncertainly above the keys. His eyes, now that Alessandro could see them clearly, didn't track to the sound. They were a light blue, beautiful but vacant to focus. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Alessandro said gently. "I'm Alessandro Rossi. I'm here for a master class later today." The boy's face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Rossi?" The Alessandro Rossi. His hands quickly retreated to his lap. "I'm so sorry, I shouldn't be here. The janitor, Mr. Thomas, he lets me play sometimes when nobody's using the auditorium. I should go." The boy stood up hastily, reaching for what Alessandro now saw was a folded white cane leaning against the piano bench. "Wait," Alessandro said, climbing the steps to the stage. "You play beautifully. What's your name?" "Elijah," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elijah Chen. Are you a student here, Elijah?" A sad smile crossed the boy's face. "No, sir. My mom works in the cafeteria. I come here after school and wait until her shift ends at 6. Alessandro glanced at the cane, then back at Elijah's unfocused eyes, understanding dawning on him. "Have you been blind since birth?" Elijah nodded. "Yes, sir. And who taught you to play like that?" "Nobody, really." Elijah's fingers fidgeted with the hem of his faded blue t-shirt. "I mean, I listen to recordings. All kinds. Classical mostly. I like your recordings the best, especially your interpretation of Chopin's nocturnes." Alessandro felt a warmth spread through his chest at the compliment, but confusion quickly followed. "But how did you learn the technique?" "The finger positioning?" Elijah shrugged. "I just feel it. The music makes sense to me, like it's telling me where my hands should go." He paused, then added, "Mr. Thomas showed me the basics, where middle C is and stuff like that. The rest I figured out." Alessandro was dumbfounded. In his 4 decades of playing and teaching, he'd never encountered raw talent like this, especially not in someone so young, and certainly not self-taught. "Would you play something else for me?" Alessandro asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite his growing excitement. Elijah hesitated, his hands twisting together nervously. "You're a famous pianist. I'm probably doing everything wrong." "That's not what I heard," Alessandro said honestly. "Please?" After a moment's hesitation, Elijah sat back down, placing his hands on the keys with remarkable accuracy. "This is something I made up," he said softly. "It's not very good." The melody that followed nearly brought Alessandro to his knees. It began simply enough, a gentle rolling theme that reminded him of falling rain. But then it evolved. Layer upon layer of complexity added with such natural progression that it seemed impossible this wasn't a published work by a seasoned composer. The piece spoke of longing, of seeing the world through touch and sound rather than sight. There were moments of frustration, discordant notes that somehow resolved into something beautiful, and passages of pure joy that made Alessandro's heart soar. When Elijah finished, the final notes lingering in the air, Alessandro found himself at a loss for words. He'd been to countless concerts, had performed with the world's greatest musicians, but nothing had moved him quite like this untrained boy's improvisation. "Elijah," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "That was extraordinary." The boy ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just something I play when I'm alone. It helps me think." Before Alessandro could respond, the auditorium doors opened and a woman in a cafeteria uniform rushed in. "Elijah, there you are. I've been looking all over." She stopped short when she spotted Alessandro. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. I hope he wasn't disturbing you." "Not at all," Alessandro said quickly. "Actually, Mrs. Chen, I'd like to speak with you about your son." "Lee," she corrected gently. "I'm Mrs. Lee. Elijah has my first husband's last name." "Mrs. Lee," Alessandro amended with a nod. "Your son has remarkable talent." She smiled, the kind of tired smile that spoke of long hours and hard work. "He loves music. Always has since he was tiny. He could hum entire songs after hearing them just once." Pride shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by worry. "We should go. They'll be setting up for your masterclass soon." Alessandro checked his watch. They still had over an hour before anyone else would arrive. "Please stay a moment. I'd like to talk to you about Elijah's future." Mrs. Lee's brow furrowed. "His future?" "As a pianist," Alessandro clarified. "Has he had any formal training?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sir, I work 2 jobs to keep our apartment." "Piano lessons." She shook her head. "We don't even own a piano." Alessandro looked at Elijah, who stood quietly beside his mother, his cane now unfolded and gripped tightly in his right hand. The boy's talent was undeniable, but so were the obstacles he faced. In that moment, something shifted inside Alessandro. The weariness that had been his constant companion these past months seemed to lift. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of purpose beyond his own performances and recordings. "Mrs. Lee," he said, making a decision that would change all their lives. "I'd like to offer Elijah lessons." "No charge." Her eyes widened. "Mr. Rossi, that's very kind, but we couldn't accept—" "Please," Alessandro interrupted. "It would be my privilege. Talent like this, it deserves to be nurtured." Elijah's face had lit up at Alessandro's words, hope written across his features. "Could I, Mom?" he whispered. "Could I really learn from Mr. Rossi?" Mrs. Lee looked from her son to Alessandro and back again. Alessandro could see the battle playing out on her face. Pride versus practicality, hope versus experience. "We can figure out the details later," Alessandro added gently. "But I believe your son could have an extraordinary future in music." "You're serious?" Mrs. Lee asked, still disbelieving. Alessandro nodded, then remembered that wasn't helpful for Elijah. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm very serious." Elijah reached for his mother's hand, finding it unerringly. "Please, Mom?" After a long moment, Mrs. Lee squeezed her son's hand. "We'll talk about it," she said, which wasn't a no. She turned to Alessandro. "Thank you, Mr. Rossi. This is unexpected." As they prepared to leave, Alessandro watched Elijah navigate the stage steps with practiced ease, his cane sweeping in smooth arcs before him. The boy paused at the bottom, turning back toward where Alessandro stood. "Mr. Rossi," he called. "Yes, Elijah?" "Even if I can't take lessons, thank you for listening. Nobody's ever really listened before." As Elijah and his mother left the auditorium, Alessandro sat down at the piano bench, still warm from the boy's presence. He placed his hands on the keys, trying to recall the melody Elijah had played. It was already fading from his memory, like trying to hold on to a dream. One thing was certain, though the boy who couldn't see had shown Alessandro something he'd been blind to for years: the pure, transformative joy of music, rediscovered through the hands of a child who played not for acclaim or perfection, but simply because the music lived inside him and needed to be set free. 3 days had passed since Alessandro Rossi first heard Elijah Chen play the piano. 3 days of phone calls, arrangements, and more excitement than Alessandro had felt in years. Now, as he sat in the small apartment in the east side of the city, he tried not to show his shock at the living conditions of the boy who had so thoroughly impressed him. The 2-bedroom apartment was clean, but cramped. Water stains marked the ceiling in one corner, and the furniture had clearly seen better days. But what struck Alessandro most was the absence of a piano, or any musical instrument at all. Mrs. Lee placed a cup of tea in front of him. "It's nothing fancy," she apologized. "Just regular tea bags." "It's perfect, thank you," Alessandro said, genuinely appreciative of her hospitality. He watched as Elijah sat quietly on the worn sofa, his fingers tapping out silent melodies on his knees. "So," Mrs. Lee began, sitting down across from Alessandro, "you really want to teach my son?" The disbelief in her voice was clear. Alessandro nodded. "More than anything. But first I'd like to understand how Elijah developed his skills without formal training, or even a piano at home." Mrs. Lee glanced at her son with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. "He's always been like this. When he was 3, he could hum entire songs after hearing them once. By 5, he was creating his own tunes." She laughed softly. "I used to take him to the mall where they had a public piano. He'd sit there for hours if I let him." Elijah shifted in his seat. "Mr. Thomas at school lets me play when no one's around," he explained. "He's taught me some basics, but mostly I just play what I hear in my head." Alessandro leaned forward, fascinated. "And how do you learn pieces like the Mozart sonata I heard you playing?" "YouTube," Elijah said simply. "Mom lets me use her phone to listen to music. I listen to the same piece over and over until I can hear every note in my mind. Then when I get to a piano, my hands just know where to go," Mrs. Lee sighed. "I wish we could have given him proper lessons, a proper piano, but after his father left and with the medical bills—" She trailed off, the unfinished sentence telling a story of struggle all too common. "Medical bills?" Alessandro asked gently. Elijah was born with his condition, but there were complications. Mrs. Lee's voice was steady, but her hands twisted anxiously in her lap. "We spent his first 2 years in and out of hospitals." Elijah's face remained impassive, suggesting he'd heard this story many times before. "May I ask?" Alessandro began carefully. "What exactly is your condition, Elijah?" "Congenital blindness due to optic nerve hypoplasia," the boy replied matter-of-factly, as if reciting from a medical textbook. "The nerves that connect my eyes to my brain never fully developed." Alessandro was struck by the clinical way the 12-year-old described his condition. It spoke of years of doctors' appointments and explanations. "The doctors told us his other senses might compensate," Mrs. Lee added, "especially hearing. I guess that's why music makes so much sense to me," Elijah finished. A small smile played on his lips. "I can't see the world, but I can hear it. And when I play piano, I can create my own world that others can hear too." The simplicity and depth of the boy's statement left Alessandro momentarily speechless. In 40 years of playing piano, he'd never articulated his connection to music quite so beautifully. "I want to help Elijah develop this gift," Alessandro said finally, turning back to Mrs. Lee. "Not just with lessons, but with access to a proper instrument and eventually, the right educational environment." Mrs. Lee's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Rossi, I appreciate your interest in my son, but we can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Alessandro replied quickly. "It's investment in extraordinary talent. And besides," he added with a smile, "teaching Elijah would be a privilege for me, not a favor to him." "Really?" Elijah perked up. "But you've played with orchestras all over the world. You've won awards. Why would you want to teach me?" Alessandro considered his answer carefully. How could he explain that hearing this boy play had rekindled something he thought he'd lost? That the pure joy in Elijah's music had reminded him why he'd fallen in love with the piano in the first place? "Because sometimes," Alessandro said slowly, "teachers learn as much from their students as students learn from their teachers." The skepticism on Mrs. Lee's face softened somewhat. How would this work exactly? Our schedule is complicated. I work 2 jobs, and getting Elijah to and from places isn't easy. I understand, Alessandro said. For now, I'm staying in the city for 3 weeks. We could start with lessons at Westfield Academy. I've already spoken to the director about using one of their practice rooms. He hesitated before adding, and I'd like to arrange for a piano to be delivered here. Mrs. Lee's eyes widened. Here, in this apartment? Mr. Rossi, we don't have the space, and the neighbors. A digital piano with headphones, Alessandro clarified. Compact enough to fit in Elijah's room, but with weighted keys that feel like a real piano. He needs to be able to practice daily. Elijah's face lit up with a hope so intense it was almost painful to witness. My own piano, really? Mrs. Lee looked at her son's expression and something in her resolved. If, and this is a big if, we agree to this arrangement, it would be a loan, not a gift. We would pay you back eventually. Alessandro knew better than to argue. Of course, he said solemnly, though he had no intention of ever accepting payment. Shall we consider this first 3 weeks a trial period?
No commitments beyond that until we see how it goes. The compromise seemed to ease Mrs. Lee's concerns.
After discussing logistics, lesson times that worked around her shifts, transportation arrangements, Alessandro prepared to leave, his mind already racing with teaching plans. At the door, Elijah reached out, his hand finding Alessandro's arm with surprising accuracy. Mr. Rossi, will you play for me sometime? I've only heard you on recordings. The request, so simple and earnest, touched Alessandro deeply. I'd be honored, he said. In fact, why don't we begin our first lesson with that? The following afternoon, Alessandro arrived at Westfield Academy an hour early. He'd arranged for a car service to bring Elijah directly from school, with the driver instructed to help the boy to the building's entrance where Alessandro would meet him. As he waited in the practice room, Alessandro found himself oddly nervous. He'd performed for royalty, for presidents, for crowds of thousands without a flutter of anxiety. Yet the thought of playing for this blind boy made his palms sweat. When Elijah arrived, his white cane tapping a path before him, Alessandro felt a surge of protectiveness. The hallways of Westfield were busy with students rushing between lessons, many casting curious glances at the boy who clearly wasn't one of them. Welcome to your first official lesson, Alessandro said, guiding Elijah into the practice room and closing the door behind them. The space was modest, just big enough for an upright piano, 2 chairs, and a small bookshelf filled with sheet music that would be useless to his new student. It smells like music in here, Elijah observed, inhaling deeply. Alessandro chuckled. What does music smell like? Wood and metal and paper and… Elijah paused, considering. And focus. Like when you're concentrating so hard on something that everything else disappears. Again, Alessandro was struck by the boy's unusual perceptiveness. You promised to play for me, Elijah reminded him, finding his way to one of the chairs. So I did. Alessandro sat at the piano bench, flexing his fingers. He'd been debating what to play, a technical showpiece to impress or something more emotional. In the end, he chose Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece that had always seemed to him like moonlight translated into sound. As he played, Alessandro found himself closing his eyes, trying to experience the music as Elijah might, through hearing alone without the distraction of sight. The notes flowed from his fingers with a sensitivity he hadn't felt in months, perhaps years. When he finished, the final chord lingering in the air, he turned to find Elijah sitting perfectly still, tears streaming down his face. That was… Elijah whispered, wiping his cheeks. I felt like I could see the moon. Alessandro swallowed the unexpected lump in his throat. Now it's your turn, he said, patting the space beside him on the bench. Show me where you are and we'll figure out where to go next. As Elijah made his way to the piano, his hand brushing the edge of the bench before sitting down, Alessandro knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right decision. Whatever talent this boy possessed, and it was extraordinary, it deserved to be nurtured, challenged and celebrated. For the next 2 hours, teacher and student explored the boundaries of Elijah's natural abilities. Alessandro was amazed to discover that the boy had perfect pitch, the rare ability to identify or produce any musical note without a reference tone. His technique, while unorthodox, was remarkably effective, and his memory was nothing short of astonishing. Once Elijah heard something, it was locked in his mind forever. "You've never had formal training," Alessandro marveled. "Yet somehow you've avoided developing bad habits that plague most self-taught pianists." Elijah's fingers danced lightly over the keys, not pressing down enough to make sound. "When you can't see, you have to listen more carefully," he said simply. "And when you listen carefully enough, the music tells you what it needs." As their first lesson came to an end, Alessandro knew he wasn't just teaching Elijah. He was witnessing the emergence of a truly unique musical voice. One that, with the right guidance, might someday change the way the world heard music altogether. 2 weeks into their lessons, Alessandro sat in the office of Dean Wilson, the stern-faced head of Westfield Academy of Music. The mahogany desk between them gleamed under the soft lighting, a stark contrast to the worn furniture in Elijah's home, where Alessandro had visited several times now. "I understand your enthusiasm, Mr. Rossi," Dean Wilson said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "But Westfield has standards to maintain. We can't simply admit a student based on unusual circumstances." Alessandro kept his expression neutral, though frustration bubbled beneath the surface. "With all due respect, Dean Wilson, Elijah's talent isn't an unusual circumstance, it's extraordinary. In my 40 years of playing and teaching, I've never encountered such natural ability." The dean leaned back in his leather chair. "And I don't doubt your assessment, but our program is intensive. It requires reading music, music theory, harmony classes, all things that would present significant challenges for a blind student with no formal background." He spread his hands in what seemed like a gesture of regret, though Alessandro detected little actual remorse. "Not to mention the financial considerations. Scholarships are extremely limited." "I'm prepared to cover his tuition personally," Alessandro replied without hesitation. The decision had been made the moment he'd heard Elijah play. Dean Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's generous, but there are other factors. Our reputation is built on producing graduates who go on to prestigious conservatories and orchestras. A student who cannot read music. Beethoven composed some of his greatest works while deaf," Alessandro interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "Are you suggesting a blind pianist couldn't achieve greatness?" "Of course not," the dean said quickly. "But Beethoven had years of traditional training before losing his hearing. Your young protege would be starting at a significant disadvantage." Alessandro leaned forward. "Give him an audition. That's all I'm asking. Let his playing speak for itself." The dean sighed, glancing at the stack of applications on his desk. "Very well. We have placement auditions next month for the fall semester. He can play then, but I must warn you, the committee will judge him by the same standards as every other applicant." "That's all I ask," Alessandro said, rising to his feet. "And Dean Wilson? You might want to prepare the committee for what they're about to hear." As Alessandro left the imposing brick building, his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Lee. "Piano delivered. He hasn't left it since. Neighbors might complain soon." The message brought a smile to his face. The digital piano had been delivered to Elijah's apartment 3 days ago, complete with high-quality headphones. Alessandro had spent hours helping the boy set it up, showing him where each button was located and explaining the various features. Elijah had absorbed the information with the same remarkable speed he showed in learning music. Later that afternoon, Alessandro arrived at the practice room to find Elijah already seated at the piano. The boy's fingers were flying over a piece Alessandro hadn't taught him, Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu, one of the composer's more technically challenging works. "I see you've been busy," Alessandro remarked, closing the door behind him. Elijah's hands jumped away from the keys. "I was just exploring," he said, a hint of guilt in his voice. "No, please continue," Alessandro encouraged him, setting down his bag. "Where did you learn that piece?" "I found it online," Elijah explained. "I've been listening to it with headphones at night after Mom goes to sleep. It's so beautiful, all those notes tumbling over each other like water." Alessandro sat beside him on the bench. "It's an incredibly difficult piece. Most students don't attempt it until they've been playing for many years." Elijah's face fell. "Was I playing it wrong?" "Not wrong," Alessandro said carefully. "Different. Your interpretation is intuitive. You feel the music rather than simply executing the notes as written." He paused. "Play it again, but this time, think about what Chopin might have been feeling when he composed it." For the next hour, Alessandro guided Elijah through the emotional landscape of the piece. He explained how the composer had written it during a turbulent period of his life, how the chaotic sections represented inner conflict while the central melody spoke of longing and hope. Elijah absorbed everything, his playing evolving with each repetition. By the end of the lesson, his rendition had transformed from technically impressive to genuinely moving. "You have a gift for emotional expression," Alessandro told him, "but now we need to work on technique. The audition committee will be looking for precision as well as passion." Elijah's hand stilled on the keys. "Audition? What audition?" Alessandro realized he hadn't yet mentioned his meeting with Dean Wilson. "I've arranged for you to audition for admission to Westfield Academy," he explained. "It's a month from now." "A real music school?" Elijah's voice was barely above a whisper. "You think I could get in?" "I know you could," Alessandro said confidently. "But it won't be easy. The committee will have doubts." "Because I'm blind," Elijah stated flatly. It wasn't a question. "Partly," Alessandro acknowledged, seeing no point in sugarcoating the truth. "And because you haven't had traditional training. But mostly because people fear what they don't understand, and your relationship with music is something few can comprehend." "Mom says people always underestimate me," Elijah said with a small smile. "She says it gives me the advantage of surprise." Alessandro chuckled. "Your mother is a wise woman. Now let's work on Bach. The committee will expect some Baroque in your repertoire." For the next 2 weeks, Alessandro pushed Elijah harder than he'd ever pushed a student before. They worked on a balanced program that would showcase both technical skill and emotional depth. A Bach prelude and fugue for precision, a Beethoven sonata movement for structure, the Chopin for romantic expression, and a contemporary piece that would highlight Elijah's interpretive abilities. Word of Alessandro's special student had spread through Westfield's faculty. Some colleagues were intrigued. Others were openly skeptical. "A blind pianist might make for an inspiring human interest story," remarked Professor Howard Reynolds after observing one of their lessons. "But the professional music world isn't built on feel-good narratives. It's brutally competitive. Watch and listen before you judge," was Alessandro's only response. But the criticism stung, particularly because he knew Elijah would face such attitudes throughout his career. 3 days before the audition, Alessandro arrived at their practice room to find Elijah already hard at work. But something was different. The boy's usual confidence seemed diminished, his shoulders tense as he played. "What's wrong?" Alessandro asked, setting down his coffee. Elijah's hand stilled. "I heard them talking," he said quietly. "Yesterday when you went to get water. Professor Reynolds and someone else. They said you were wasting your time. That you were only teaching me because you felt sorry for me." Alessandro silently cursed his colleague's carelessness. "And do you believe that?" Elijah shrugged, his fingers tracing the edges of the keys without pressing them. "Maybe, you're famous. You could be teaching students who can actually see the music, who've been playing their whole lives." Alessandro sat down beside him. "Let me tell you something, Elijah. For years I've played to sold-out concert halls. I've received standing ovations and glowing reviews. But somewhere along the way I stopped feeling the music. It became mechanical. Perfect technique but empty inside." He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then I heard you play. You reminded me what music is supposed to be. Not just notes on a page, but something alive. I'm not teaching you out of pity. I'm teaching you because you've already taught me something invaluable." Elijah's face remained turned away, but Alessandro could see him processing the words. "Those professors," Alessandro continued, "they've been teaching so long by the book that they've forgotten there are other ways to experience music. Your way isn't wrong, it's just different. And sometimes different is exactly what art needs to evolve." Slowly, Elijah nodded. "I'm still scared," he admitted. "What if I mess up at the audition?" "Then you mess up," Alessandro said simply. "Even the greatest pianists make mistakes. What matters is how you recover, how you make that mistake part of your musical story." The day of the audition arrived with a dreary rainfall that matched Alessandro's nervous mood. He'd met Elijah and Mrs. Lee at their apartment that morning, helping the boy select appropriate attire, a simple white button-down shirt and black pants that Mrs. Lee had carefully ironed the night before. Now they sat in the waiting area outside, Westfield's recital hall, listening as other young hopefuls performed their pieces for the committee. The level was high, Child prodigies from across the country had come to earn a coveted spot at the prestigious academy. Mrs. Lee clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white with tension.
There are so many talented kids, she whispered to Alessandro.
All with years of training. None with Elijah's gift, Alessandro assured her, though his own stomach was knotted with anxiety. He'd done everything he could to prepare the boy, but would the committee see past their preconceptions? When Elijah's name was called, Alessandro helped him navigate to the center of the stage. The grand piano gleamed under the spotlights, imposing and magnificent. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Chen," came Dean Wilson's voice from the darkened audience where the committee sat. Elijah stood for a moment, his cane in one hand. Then he folded it carefully, placed it on the bench beside him, and positioned his hands over the keys. The Bach began, precise, controlled, each voice in the fugue distinct and clear. Alessandro watched from the side of the stage, holding his breath as Elijah moved seamlessly from Baroque to classical, his Beethoven filled with both power and nuance. When the final piece ended, silence filled the hall. Then from the darkness a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined and another, until the applause was substantial though not universal. "Thank you, Mr. Chen." Dean Wilson's voice cut through the applause. "The committee will deliberate. Results will be posted next week." As Alessandro guided Elijah from the stage, he caught sight of Professor Reynolds leaning toward another committee member, whispering something with a furrowed brow. The battle, Alessandro realized, was far from over. But Elijah had played magnificently, better than in any practice session. No matter what the committee decided, the boy had proven himself as a musician of extraordinary potential. "How did I do?" Elijah asked once they were in the hallway, his voice small and uncertain. Alessandro squeezed his shoulder gently. "You played from your heart. And that, my young friend, is all any true musician can ever do." The envelope arrived a week after the audition. Mrs. Lee called Alessandro immediately, her voice tight with excitement. "It's here, from Westfield," she said. "Elijah won't open it. He wants you to be with us when he does." Alessandro canceled his afternoon meeting and took a taxi straight to their apartment. His heart pounded with anticipation as he climbed the 3 flights of stairs. He'd been checking his email obsessively for news, had even called Dean Wilson's office twice, but had received no information about the committee's decision. When Mrs. Lee opened the door, her face gave nothing away. She led him to the small living room where Elijah sat at his digital piano, headphones on, fingers moving silently over the keys. The unopened envelope lay on the coffee table. "Elijah," Mrs. Lee called, touching her son's shoulder gently. "Mr. Rossi is here." The boy removed his headphones, his face turning toward the sound of Alessandro's footsteps. "Did you see the letter?" he asked, trying and failing to keep his voice casual. "I did," Alessandro said, sitting down beside him. "Are you ready to open it?" Elijah nodded but made no move to retrieve the envelope. "What if they said no?" "Then we find another path," Alessandro answered honestly. "There's always another path for true talent." Mrs. Lee picked up the envelope and placed it in her son's hands. "Whatever it says, I'm proud of you," she said softly. Elijah's fingers traced the edges of the envelope before carefully tearing it open. He pulled out the letter and handed it to his mother. "Can you read it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Lee unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the text. Her expression remained unchanged as she began to read. "Dear Mr. Chen, thank you for your audition for admission to Westfield Academy of Music's Young Artist program. The committee was impressed by your technical ability and musical sensitivity." Alessandro held his breath. "After careful consideration, we are pleased to offer you conditional acceptance into our program." Elijah's face lit up with a smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the entire room. "Conditional?" he asked. "What does that mean?" Mrs. Lee continued reading. "Your acceptance is contingent upon successful completion of our summer intensive program, where we will assess your ability to participate in our regular curriculum, despite the unique challenges your condition presents. Additionally, we will require ongoing evaluation of your progress during your first semester." The smile on Elijah's face dimmed slightly, but didn't disappear entirely. "They're giving me a chance," he said. Alessandro felt a mixture of emotions: joy that Elijah had been accepted, frustration at the conditional nature of the acceptance. "It's more than a chance," he said firmly. "It's a foot in the door, and once you're through that door, you'll show them exactly what you're capable of." Mrs. Lee was still reading the letter, her brow furrowed. "The summer intensive starts in 3 weeks. 5 days a week, 6 hours a day." She looked up, concern in her eyes. "Alessandro, how will we manage this?" "My work schedule. We'll figure it out," Alessandro assured her. "I'll be here for another month, and after that, I can arrange for transportation." The logistics would be complicated, but he was determined to make it work. Elijah stood up and moved to his piano, his hands finding the keys with practiced ease. Without a word, he began to play. Not one of his audition pieces, but Debussy's Clair de Lune, the first piece he'd heard Alessandro perform. His interpretation was different from Alessandro's, more hesitant in places, more bold in others, but filled with genuine emotion. When he finished, both Alessandro and Mrs. Lee were silent, moved by the performance. "That was my thank you," Elijah said simply. The first 2 weeks of preparation for the summer intensive flew by. Alessandro worked with Elijah daily, not just on piano technique, but on music theory and history as well. The boy absorbed information like a sponge, his memory allowing him to retain complex concepts after hearing them just once. But as the start date approached, Alessandro noticed a shift in Elijah's demeanor. The boy who had once been eager to learn, who had practiced for hours without complaint, now seemed distracted and anxious during their lessons. "Is everything all right?" Alessandro asked after a particularly difficult session, where Elijah had struggled with a relatively simple passage. "Fine," Elijah replied too quickly, his fingers restlessly tapping the edge of the piano. Alessandro waited, saying nothing. Sometimes silence was the most effective tool a teacher had. After a long moment, Elijah sighed. "I heard Mom crying last night," he admitted. "On the phone with her sister. She thinks I don't know, but the walls are thin." Alessandro felt a knot form in his stomach. "Do you know why she was upset?" Elijah nodded, his sightless eyes directed toward the floor. "Money. The summer program costs extra, materials, special sessions. Even with your help for the tuition," he trailed off. "She's trying to pick up more shifts at her second job." This was news to Alessandro. Mrs. Lee had insisted on contributing something toward Elijah's education, despite Alessandro's offer to cover all costs. It was a matter of pride for her, he understood, but he hadn't realized the financial strain it was causing. "I'll speak with her," Alessandro promised. "There are foundations, scholarships specifically for talented students with disabilities. I don't want special treatment," Elijah interrupted, his voice suddenly hard. "I don't want to be the poor blind charity case." Alessandro recognized the pride in the boy's voice, the same pride he'd seen in Mrs. Lee. "It's not charity to accept help when it's earned," he said gently, "and you've earned it with your talent." Elijah didn't respond, but his posture remained rigid, unconvinced. The following day, Elijah didn't show up for their lesson. Alessandro waited 30 minutes before calling Mrs. Lee, who was equally surprised by her son's absence. "He left for the bus stop like usual," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Let me call his school." A call back 10 minutes later confirmed Alessandro's worry. Elijah hadn't attended school that day. Mrs. Lee left work immediately, and Alessandro began a search of the places he knew were important to Elijah. The park near their apartment where street musicians sometimes played, the public library where he listened to music on the free computers. It was late afternoon when Alessandro thought to check Westfield Academy. He found Elijah in their practice room, sitting not at the piano but in the corner, his knees drawn up to his chest. "Everyone's been worried about you," Alessandro said softly, closing the door behind him. "I called Mom already," Elijah replied. "Told her I'm safe." Alessandro sat down on the floor beside him. "Want to tell me what's going on?" Elijah was silent for so long that Alessandro wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was small but resolute. "I can't do this." "This?" "The summer program, Westfield, all of it." Elijah's hands curled into fists on his knees. "I heard some of the students yesterday, after you left. They were in the hallway talking about the blind kid who got special treatment, how I'll never make it through the program, how I'll embarrass myself and everyone else." Alessandro felt a surge of anger toward these unknown students but kept his voice calm. "And you believed them?" They're right, though, aren't they? Elijah's voice cracked slightly. This place isn't built for someone like me. Everything is visual. Sheet music, theory diagrams, conductors' movements. And even if I somehow make it through, what then? What orchestra will hire a blind pianist? What concert hall will take a chance on me? The despair in the boy's voice was palpable, and Alessandro recognized it all too well. He'd faced his own moments of doubt throughout his career, different circumstances, but the same crushing weight of uncertainty. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone else? Alessandro asked after a moment. Elijah nodded slightly. 6 years ago, I was diagnosed with early-onset arthritis in my hands, Alessandro said, flexing his fingers unconsciously. Doctors told me I'd likely have to stop performing within a decade, that my joints would become too painful, too stiff for the demands of concert playing. Elijah turned toward him, surprise evident on his face. For months, I was exactly where you are now, Alessandro continued, ready to give up. What was the point of continuing if I knew it would all be taken away? I even canceled a tour, told my agent I was taking a sabbatical. In reality, I barely touched the piano for nearly a year. What changed? Elijah asked quietly. I realized I was focusing on the wrong thing. I was obsessed with what I might lose in the future, instead of what I could create in the present. Alessandro smiled sadly. We all have limitations, Elijah. Some are visible, some aren't, but they don't define what we can contribute to the world. But it's different, Elijah protested. You've already proven yourself. You've had a career. I'm just starting and already facing walls I can't climb. Then we find a way around them, or through them, or we build something new entirely, Alessandro insisted. Do you think I would have spent these weeks working with you if I didn't believe you have something unique to offer? Something the music world needs? Elijah didn't answer, but Alessandro could see he was listening. Those students who were talking, they're afraid. Alessandro continued, not of you failing, but of you succeeding. Because if you succeed despite the obstacles they think are insurmountable, what excuse do they have for their own limitations? A ghost of a smile flickered across Elijah's face. My mom says something like that too. Smart woman, your mother. Alessandro stood up, brushing off his pants. Now, are you ready to get back to work? Or do you need more time? Elijah hesitated. I'm still scared, he admitted. What if I can't do it? Then you can't, Alessandro said simply. But you won't know until you try. And isn't trying, really trying, better than wondering what might have been? Slowly, Elijah uncurled from his position and stood up. I missed a whole day of school, he said, a hint of his usual humor returning. Mom's going to make me do extra homework. I'll put in a good word for you, Alessandro promised, guiding him toward the piano. Now, let's work on that Beethoven passage that was giving you trouble yesterday. I have a new approach I think might help. As Elijah's fingers found the keys, Alessandro realized that this moment helping a talented young musician overcome not just technical challenges, but the deeper hurdles of self-doubt felt more meaningful than any standing ovation he'd received in his career. Whatever happened with the summer program, with Westfield, with Elijah's future as a pianist, this connection through music had already changed both their lives, immeasurably. The summer program at Westfield Academy was in its third week when Alessandro Rossi received a phone call from Professor Reynolds. We need to talk about Elijah. Jen, the professor said without preamble. Are you available to meet this afternoon? Alessandro's stomach tightened with anxiety. Is something wrong? Just come to my office at 4. Professor Reynolds replied, his tone giving nothing away. For the next 3 hours, Alessandro couldn't focus on anything. He'd been monitoring Elijah's progress from a distance, calling Mrs. Lee regularly and speaking with Elijah every few days. The boy had seemed to be doing well, though the intensity of the program left him exhausted most evenings. Alessandro had delayed his departure from the city twice already, canceling performances to stay close by as Elijah adjusted to the program. His agent was becoming increasingly frustrated, but Alessandro couldn't bring himself to leave while the boy's position at Westfield remained precarious. At 4 o'clock sharp, Alessandro knocked on Professor Reynolds's door. Come in, called the familiar voice. Alessandro entered to find not just Reynolds but Dean Wilson and 2 other faculty members seated around a small conference table. Their expressions were unreadable. Please sit down, Dean Wilson said, gesturing to an empty chair. Alessandro remained standing. What's this about? Has Elijah done something wrong? Professor Reynolds cleared his throat. On the contrary, that's what we need to discuss. He exchanged glances with his colleagues before continuing. Mr. Rossi, when you first brought Elijah to our attention, many of us, myself included, were skeptical. We've never had a student with his challenges. You mean his blindness, Alessandro said bluntly. Yes, Reynolds acknowledged, and his lack of formal training. But after 3 weeks in our summer program, he paused, seeming to search for words. Dean Wilson stepped in. What Howard is trying to say is that we may have been too hasty in our judgment. Elijah's performance in the program has been exceptional. Exceptional? Alessandro repeated, hardly daring to hope. His ability to absorb complex theoretical concepts by ear alone is remarkable, said a woman Alessandro recognized as the head of music theory. He's memorized entire sonata forms after hearing them once, and his interpretive skills are unlike anything I've encountered in 30 years of teaching, finished Professor Reynolds, a hint of grudging admiration in his voice. Alessandro slowly sat down, relief flooding through him. So you're removing the conditional status of his acceptance. The faculty members exchanged looks again, this time with unmistakable excitement. We want to do more than that, Dean Wilson said. We'd like to feature him in our summer showcase next weekend. Alessandro's eyebrows shot up. The showcase? But that's usually reserved for the most advanced students. Precisely, Professor Reynolds nodded. It's an opportunity for our finest young musicians to perform for the public, the press, and potential donors. We believe Elijah's story, and more importantly, his talent, could make a significant impact. Alessandro felt a surge of pride, followed quickly by concern. Does Elijah know about this? Not yet, Dean Wilson admitted. We wanted to discuss it with you first as his primary teacher and advocate. The showcase is a high-pressure environment, Alessandro mused. Elijah's been doing well, but this would put him in the spotlight in a way he hasn't experienced before. That's true, the theory professor agreed. But we've observed his progress closely. We believe he's ready. Alessandro thought for a moment. What would you want him to play? That's actually why we called you here, Professor Reynolds said, leaning forward. Elijah mentioned he's been working on an original composition, something he started before joining the program but has been refining in his composition classes. Yes, Alessandro nodded. He calls it Colors I've Never Seen. We've only heard fragments, the dean said. But what we've heard is extraordinary. Would he be ready to perform it in its entirety? Alessandro considered the question carefully. The piece was deeply personal to Elijah, a musical exploration of how he imagined colors might sound. The boy had been reluctant to share it with anyone besides Alessandro and his mother, calling it too private and not ready. I think that should be Elijah's decision, Alessandro said finally. This composition comes from his core. It's not just music to him. It's his way of connecting to a visual world he's never experienced. Of course, Dean Wilson agreed. We just hoped you might prepare him for the idea. Alessandro promised to speak with Elijah and left the meeting with mixed emotions. The faculty's recognition of Elijah's talent was everything he'd hoped for, but he worried about putting too much pressure on the boy too soon. He found Elijah in one of the practice rooms, working through a Chopin etude. The boy's technique had improved dramatically in the weeks since joining the program, his fingers moving with new confidence and precision. That sounded wonderful, Alessandro said when Elijah finished the piece. Elijah turned toward his voice, a smile lighting up his face. Mr. Rossi, I didn't know you were coming today. I had a meeting with the faculty, Alessandro explained, sitting beside him on the bench. About you, actually. Elijah's smile faltered. Did I do something wrong? Just the opposite, Alessandro assured him. They're very impressed with your progress. So impressed that they want to feature you in the summer showcase next weekend. Elijah's hands froze above the keys. The showcase? But that's for the best students. Exactly. What would I play? Elijah asked, his voice barely audible. Alessandro took a deep breath. They've heard about your composition. Colors I've Never Seen. They'd like you to premiere it at the showcase. Elijah was silent for a long moment. It's not ready, he said finally. It's still just pieces, ideas, and it's private. I told them it would be your decision, Alessandro said gently. No pressure. Elijah's fingers found the keys again, playing a soft, meandering melody that Alessandro recognized as part of his composition. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. "I think," Alessandro said carefully, "that your music deserves to be heard, but only when you're ready to share it." For the next 2 days, Elijah was unusually quiet during his lessons. Alessandro didn't push him about the showcase, but he could tell the boy was wrestling with the decision. On the 3rd day, Elijah arrived at their lesson with a determined expression. "I'll do it," he announced, "but I need your help to finish the piece. It still needs something." Alessandro agreed, and for the next week they worked intensively on the composition. Elijah had the core themes well established, each representing how he imagined a different color might feel and sound. But the structure needed refinement. "How does it end?" Alessandro asked as they worked through the final section. Elijah's hands hovered over the keys. "I don't know," he admitted. "I can imagine the colors separately, but I can't picture how they all come together." "Maybe that's your ending," Alessandro suggested, not trying to blend them but celebrating each one individually, then leaving space for the listener to imagine their own rainbow. Elijah considered this, then began to play, a cascade of themes representing red, blue, green, yellow, each distinct but harmonically connected. The piece ended not with a decisive final chord but with an open question, a musical ellipsis inviting the listener to continue the journey. "Perfect," Alessandro whispered when Elijah finished. "It's perfect." The night of the showcase arrived with all the nervous energy of a major concert. Backstage at Westfield's Grand Hall, Elijah sat quietly in a corner, his fingers moving in silent rehearsal on his knees. Mrs. Lee approached Alessandro, worry etched on her face. "He's so nervous," she whispered. "I've never seen him like this." "Pre-performance anxiety happens to everyone," Alessandro assured her, though he too was concerned by Elijah's unusual stillness. "I'll talk to him." Alessandro sat beside Elijah. "Feeling the pressure?" he asked gently. Elijah nodded. "What if I mess up? What if they don't understand what I'm trying to say with the music?" "Let me tell you a secret about performing," Alessandro said, leaning close. "Everyone feels this way before they go on stage. Even me after all these years. You get nervous?" Elijah asked, disbelief clear in his voice. "Terrified," Alessandro admitted. "My hands shake. My heart pounds. Sometimes I feel like I might be sick. So how do you do it? How do you go out there?" Alessandro thought about his answer carefully. "I remind myself why I play music in the first place. Not for the audience, not for the critics, but for that moment when nothing exists except the conversation between myself and the piano. When I find that space, it doesn't matter who's listening or what they think." Elijah's tension seemed to ease slightly. "Like when I play at home, when it's just me and the music." "Exactly," Alessandro nodded. "Find that place tonight. The rest will take care of itself." Soon it was time. The hall was packed, not just with parents and students, but with local press, potential donors, and even a few representatives from prestigious conservatories scouting for future talent. Dean Wilson gave a brief introduction, explaining the unique circumstances of Elijah's admission to Westfield and praising his exceptional progress. As Elijah was led to the piano, a hushed murmur swept through the audience. The sight of a small blind boy taking his place at the grand piano created an immediate sense of anticipation. Alessandro watched from the wings, his heart hammering as if he were the one performing. Mrs. Lee stood beside him, gripping his arm so tightly it almost hurt. For a long moment, Elijah sat motionless at the piano. The silence stretched until Alessandro began to worry that stage fright had frozen him completely. Then slowly, Elijah's hands rose and touched the keys. The first notes of Colors I've Never Seen filled the hall, a tentative melody representing what Elijah imagined as blue, cool, and flowing like water. As he continued to play, his confidence grew. The music became more complex, more passionate, each section painting a vivid sonic picture of colors Elijah had never actually seen, but somehow deeply understood. Alessandro watched in awe as the boy lost himself in the performance, his face reflecting every emotion in the music. The audience sat spellbound, many leaning forward in their seats as if drawn physically toward the sound. When Elijah reached the final section, the cascade of colors he and Alessandro had crafted together, the music took an unexpected turn. Instead of playing each theme separately as they had rehearsed, Elijah began to weave them together in a complex counterpoint they had never discussed. Red intertwined with blue, green danced around yellow, purple emerged from their combination. A true musical rainbow that shouldn't have worked theoretically but created a breathtaking harmonic tapestry. Alessandro gasped audibly. What Elijah was doing was beyond his technical training, beyond what should have been possible for him at this stage. It was pure musical intuition, the kind that couldn't be taught. The piece ended not with the open question they had planned, but with a single, perfect, resolving chord that seemed to contain all the colors at once, a musical equivalent of white light. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the audience erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes. Mrs. Lee was openly sobbing beside Alessandro, her hands pressed to her mouth in astonishment. As the applause continued, Alessandro looked across the stage to where Professor Reynolds stood. The once skeptical professor met his eyes and slowly nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. Elijah remained seated at the piano, his expression one of peaceful satisfaction. He had found that private space Alessandro had described, the place where nothing existed but the conversation between musician and instrument. And in doing so, he had invited everyone in the hall to glimpse a world of colors as he imagined them, more vivid and moving than many had ever experienced with their own eyes. In that moment, Alessandro knew with absolute certainty that the boy who couldn't see had shown them all what it truly meant to vision, not just with eyes, but with heart and soul and the transformative power of music.